So, what I want to talk about today is some of the things that are happening in our monetary system, some of the problems, some of the challenges, some of the risks, and also what some possible alternatives are, like Bitcoin or free banking, etc. We have three very distinguished panelists to that end. First, all the way on the right, we have Professor Antal Fekete, monetary scientist and mathematician, a whole long list of accomplishments, including some of the most interesting ones in his retirement, actually, or in his official retirement, including, for instance, the new Austrian School of Economics, which some of you might know. In the middle, we have Stacy Herbert, TV presenter and producer, co-host of the Kaiser Report. I suspect by some of the reactions to Jacob's talk that some of you have seen an episode or two. It's about a lot of different topics, but particularly about the monetary and the financial system. And then, of course, we have Martijn van der Linden, who is also a monetary scientist. He's writing a dissertation on the phenomenon of money at Delft University of Technology, and also an activist and co-founder of a Dutch NGO called Ons Geld, literally translated, Our Money. So a warm welcome to all three of you. Thank you for being here. Okay, so I wanted to actually start with something Jacob already mentioned. He's mentioned that there's been some unconventional monetary policies. One very important one, I think, is quantitative easing. Stacy, you speak a lot about quantitative easing on your show. Maybe you can explain to us first in plain English what it is and why central banks have turned to this, or at least some central banks.
I've actually got a quote from the Bank of England, what their aim is with quantitative easing. And by the way, I'm not an economist like these two, which is why I wore a leather jacket to kind of look like one. So I think that's the new trend, apparently, in economists. So here's the Bank of England's definition of what quantitative easing is meant to achieve. Quantitative easing, they say, is an unconventional form of monetary policy where a central bank creates new money electronically to buy financial assets like government bonds, or in the case of the US government, basically mortgage-backed securities. This process aims to directly increase private sector spending in the economy and return inflation to target. But as we know, it's basically created, it's turned the rich richer, as a opinion piece in the Financial Times yesterday from a hedge fund manager said. It's turned us richer. As Richmond Federal Reserve Bank President Jeffrey Lacker said, it is in order to aid the housing market. And this kind of goes back with what the previous guest was saying about basically we now use monetary policy instead of fiscal policy to run our economies. And part of the reason is that the population itself no longer, in many regions, Anglo-Saxon economies like America and the UK, have what David Graeber would call bullshit jobs. Everybody works for, they have bullshit jobs working in service sector. And I think that housing prices is what all these economies, all these central bankers are targeting. Initially, quantitative easing was about saving the banks from all their fraud, all their fraudulent lending, all their bad lending. And then now it's in order to increase housing prices because wages are not increasing to support all the fraudulent debt that is still out there.
Okay. So central banks have turned to sort of buying these assets from banks, which are somewhat riskier, and so we see quite a bit of changes. Mr. Fekete, do you have the same kind of perspective? How well do you think quantitative easing has worked in the US?
Well, I respectfully disagree with Jacob. I don't think the central banks have visibility. They have just the opposite. I don't believe that their monetary policy is succeeding. They want more inflation, and they get us into a terrible deflation, which is unprecedented for the past 60 years, and it's going to get worse. And why is it that they get us deflation. And even if they got us inflation, that would be just falling from the frying pan into the fire. So they have nothing. They have no policy to save us. They have policy to push us worse into the hell of financial crisis, an unprecedented financial crisis, destruction of all values, monetary and other, which won't spare anybody, and it will mean a terrible economic pain, especially for those who cannot fend for themselves. And I just cut it short by giving you a hint. Why is it that the central bank policy is counterproductive? It achieves the exact opposite what it says that it would achieve. The reason is because as quantitative easing succeeds, in quotation mark, this means, of course, more money in circulation, and it means lower interest rates. And lower interest rate is a prescription for capital destruction. So when they succeed in lower interest rates, and now it could be zero or it could be even negative, as the Swiss example shows, then they are destroying capital. And capital is what keeps us alive and keeps us feeding, keeps us healthy, keeps us being productive.
So may I ask a clarification on your position? Because we just heard Stacy speaking about inflated housing prices, but you're speaking of deflation. So who's suffering from the deflation?
Mostly everybody suffers, because deflation in plain English means destruction of wealth, destruction of economic values. And it means more unemployment, it means collapsing housing prices, it means collapsing bubbles, collapsing stock market, and more general spread of poverty all over the world, including the first world, the second world, and the third world, and all the other worlds which may exist.
Let us turn to that a little bit later. I just want to quickly get Martijn's view on these matters, because you also have some ideas about quantitative easing. Europe's just started quantitative easing. Briefly, what are your views on this?
Now, the main point that I want to make is that I think that central banks are absolutely not neutral and independent. So the decision to buy financial assets is a really important decision, and there are alternatives. And I want to mention three. And the first is called people quantitative easing, and just you hand over money to the people. So all Europeans get just €1,000. It's, I think, a much more direct way to inject money in the economy, so it doesn't end up in financial markets. The second is strategic quantitative easing. And with strategic quantitative easing, you create new money, you hand it over to politicians, and they invest in infrastructure. And a third one that I want to mention is green quantitative easing. And green quantitative easing, you also create money and you invest it in a transition towards a renewable energy system, for instance. And in this way, so the decision to inject money in financial markets, mainly, as the quote of the Bank of England clearly explains, it is a political decision. And quite often you hear central bankers saying that the central bank is independent and politically neutral, and it's just, I think it's just not true. These kinds of decisions are really influence all aspects of our economy and our society. And till now, I totally agree, quantitative easing has a couple of things has reached. Raising inequality, financial instability only increased, and also we have seen asset price inflation. So we just see bubbles on asset markets.
So if I may summarize your position, I see some agreement in what's happened, but you're posing an alternative. What do Stacy and Antal think of this alternative, these alternative strategies for quantitative easing?
What do you think of the people's QE, as they call it, giving quantitative easing for the people, as it's being called in the United Kingdom? So you, instead of giving money to the bankers, you give it to the people.
Dropping money from helicopters.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dropping
Exactly,
money
very
from
good.
helicopters.
With Janet at the controls.
Yeah.
Not for me, thank you.
Okay. Okay.
You know, I might say there is one thing. I studied literature and writing, writing plays, screenplays, and there is one thing common between us is Aristotle. And Aristotle, of course, in politics, wrote about the basic, fundamental requirements for a sound money. And in Aristotle's Poetics, you learn about the basic fundamentals of a good play, a good tragedy, a good comedy. And I think central bankers have lost the plot. And one of the things that Aristotle would say about a good drama, a good tragedy, is that the worst of them all is for the bad guy to have bad fortune and then be given good fortune by the end. And I think that's what has happened with this quantitative easing. I think, however, without the fact that we see that we're at this in a system whereby the rich are getting richer because of central bank policy, because of government acquiescing their power as well to the financial sector, to the central banks. I think it has resulted in reinvention of money. I think it has resulted in people being aware that actually they've given up too much power to these people to create all the fraud they want and that we pay. And I think the fact that Bitcoin was created in 2009 and the white paper released talking about these sort of facts, I think the mindset of the people, the narrative that the central banks are telling you is not going down well with the audience.
So can I be a boogeyman? Don't shoot me, please. So the goal of the ECB is price stability. There's a lot of evidence that price stability is important for productive, long-term economic growth. And if you look at the history of the ECB and let's say the Euro system, actually I should say, in the last 15 years, they've been quite successful at that. So the inflation rate is reasonably stable. And also the dispersion in the inflation rates is nothing out of the ordinary.
But look at house prices, look at rent prices, look at commodity prices.
Okay.
Commodity oil went up to 147, down to 40, up to 100 and something, down to 38.
So I don't actually know
Look at this, the price of medical services, legal services, price of education. Look at anything that matters for the middle class. This is terrible.
So may I...
A terrible lie that the inflation has been stabilized, tamed, and is under the care of the central banks. It's well controlled. It's not.
So is the problem with the...
Look at what their attempts to control. So look at what the misallocation of capital has happened since the central banks intervened in the economy as it has. So look at one example in the US is the trillions of dollars that were thrown into the black hole of fracking. All these people threw money in there, and it only made sense in a world where the Fed has your back, where the Feds drove interest rates down to zero. Now all that money is gone. It was misallocated. It produced nothing but
So is
turmoil.
one of the problems with the central bank, if I'm understanding this correctly, the actual price indexes that they're using, the actual indicators that they're using?
Yeah, they have a very narrow definition of inflation. So that's indeed a big problem.
Well, as far as I am concerned, the central bankers are in a race to the bottom. And this means that they are working on the destruction of the money which they provide to society. And they are trying to push the value of money. And now they say even paper money is out and electronic money, digital money is in, because we can we have better control of money in the people's pocket if we put it digital and if we make it electronic.
Good. Okay. Okay. Let's stop on quantitative easing. So I'm already hearing one agreement here. the central bank is using wrong indicators. So that's already a consensus among the panel. I think that's a very valuable point. I just very quickly want to turn to the commercial banking system. So we heard earlier Mr. De Haan talk about some of the measures that have been taken within the Eurosystem, capital controls, restrictions, proprietary trading, all these kinds of things. But then we also heard Mr. Luijendijk, who said, well, there's still a lot of perverse incentives in the banking system. How do we think about the health of the banking system? I've already heard of one or two things, but...
It's deplorable.
Okay.
Their balance sheets are cooked, faked, and mean absolutely nothing.
Okay, great.
If J.P. Morgan said money is gold and everything else is credit, well, I have to say that's reinventing money should mean reinventing gold.
Okay.
Yeah, well, in fact, J.P. Morgan's successor entity, J.P. Morgan Chase, they, if reinventing money is gold, everything else is fraud. I don't believe that there are as many good people at banks as the previous guest suggested. If you look at the fact that Goldman Sachs was openly selling sacks of shit to pension funds across America, that all the LIBOR chat about defrauding investors around the world in exchange for a sushi lunch. I think this is widespread. If every single thing they touch turns to fraud, that is a problem.
And as you mentioned earlier, with quantitative easing, it now seems like central banks are also bailing out some of these bad decisions.
They're transferring that fraudulent debt is what they're transferring. There are bad decisions. They made bad investments, malinvestments, partly because of the Fed. And the Fed caused them to misallocate the capital. But also the Fed took on all their fraud because of Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan's ideology was that fraud would regulate itself, that he was against regulating for fraud because that bankers would they wouldn't want to commit too much fraud to take down the whole system. Well, you know how that worked out.
So maybe, Martijn, we can start with you. Because I do want to move on to some alternative ideas now. So what can we actually do so we're talking about commercial banks that aren't very healthy. We're talking about central banks that are using wrong indicators, seem to have policies that are very beneficial to banks, that creating inflation in assets, but maybe also deflation in the economy in the longer term. So what kind of alternatives can we think of to make this better?
Now, I think one of the main questions today is which part of the financial system should be public and which parts are private. And we suggest that we should split the money system, so the money supply, and the payment system of the credit system. And if you do that, we have a money system, then we can reach price stability there. And if people give credit to each other, then there's a private risk and people can fail there. So you should be really rethinking the public and private parts of the monetary system. So it's not about left-wing or right-wing, but it's to make clear, what is public and what is private. And I think in general, if we look at the incentives for commercial banks, so as long as the huge commercial banks are striving for profit maximization of shareholder value, then you will see all kind of frauds and all kind of problems, because there is a drive to make as much debt or to sell as much financial products as possible, and that's absolutely not social optimal.
But how can we create banks that aren't profit maximizers?
Now, then you have to rethink the structure of banks. So the first thing is you should be clear about money and credit, split that. And the second thing is, now, if we have 10 banks who work with existing money, so they invest, what kind of incentives do we give them? And if you want them to maximize their profit, that's quite hard. And I think you get all wrong behavior.
But the problem with that, as the previous guest had said, is that if you present that to the actual voter, you have to tell them your house price is not going to rise by £80,000 a year in London, and they're going to say, "Fuck that! I don't want that system. I want my house price to go up £80,000 a year because I only make 30,000."
Now, I think that more and more people are becoming aware that house prices can't raise forever. And the same is true for asset prices. So we need a broad discussion within society that we share our views on this kind of topics, and that it's not normal that you don't work and your house prices rise. Yeah. So the only real value that we can create is productivity. And that's also the meaning of economics, is to be productive, to make useful things for each other.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that in the UK the numbers are how unproductive the worker is there compared to the French or the German or even the American worker.
Indeed. So where economics is about, we moved away from the original day that we need productive things to have wealthy lives. And more we focus on all kind of financial assets and making money out of money, and that's just not where economics is about.
Mr. Fekete, what do you think about this idea of separating the creation of money and credit?
All right. I start the way I am thinking about
okay,
it.
Yes, please. Yeah.
All right. It may be utopistic to demand that they should put gold coins into circulation and gold should be hand-to-hand money. But it's not utopistic to demand that the banks should have the best assets in the form of gold bills. That means that you produce a good which is in demand, the public demands it, and the bank accepts a gold bill against it which is payable in gold coin in 91 days, as Adam Smith's real bills doctrine demanded. That would save the system, and it would save the face for central banks who refuse to demand or make the treasury issue gold coin.
And as I know, you've actually worked in Mexico on a plan like this.
That's correct. Okay. That's in silver, and the same for gold. Yeah. And silver may be, the two may be working miracles together, silver coins and gold coins.
Okay, so there's some alternative ideas. I want to finish with one final question, and I want pretty quick answers because we don't have much time anymore. What do we think of alternative currencies, Bitcoin, Citibank, and so on, now making their own currencies? From each of the panelists, what's your idea on this? Good, bad?
I like Bitcoin. Kaiser Report was it was actually the first television news station in the world to broadcast about Bitcoin in 2011 when it was down at like $3 a Bitcoin. And I like that it's permissionless. You don't have to ask permission from anybody to use it, and they can't shut it down, they can't control it. These big 9 banks can try to introduce their own SWIFT-like version of it. I think it'll fail, let them try.
Okay.
But let's not have the central banks bail them out, because there is no Bitcoin central bank to bail them out when it fails.
Mr. Fekete?
A lot of people ask the question, who invented Bitcoins? For one, I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out in the end that the Bitcoin was invented in the US Treasury.
Okay, Martijn, a final thought on this?
I have nothing against complementary currencies and Bitcoins, and I think the technology behind is really promising, so that's, I think, the most important thing. But my PhD is about the question, what is money? And there's a big difference between money and currencies, and that's, I think, what we should really be aware of.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Let's move to some questions in the audience here. Maybe in the back there, I see 2 hands up. Oh, sorry. Well, we'll start in the front. Come to.
I do it? Yeah. There was the question, and Joris Luijendijk talked about it. We need fundamental changes. Wouldn't it help if we as a society say, the status is in garbage. Getting the garbage out, collecting the garbage, is the most status job you can get. So all narcissists will get into garbage collecting.
Okay,
which
so you want
saves
to
the
overthrow
banking
the
system.
people who are currently running the system. Is that the idea?
Sorry?
What's your question?
The question is, how do we start the discussion on the fundamental issues?
Good. Martijn, that's a good question maybe for you actually. Or
Now, I can explain a bit what we try to do in the Netherlands. So we started a couple of, about 1 year ago, Citizens Initiative, together with the theater group De Verleiders. And there's the question, who should be allowed to create money under which circumstances? And we got about 110,000 signatures, and it will be discussed in the parliament on the 14th of October of this year. So that's one way to do it. And I totally agree that politicians don't discuss the right questions. So it's the first task is to put the right questions on the agenda, the right topics, and it happens gradually. So there's no real answer to no one single answer, but just more and more people are becoming aware that these kinds of questions are important. So I think we'll progress.
Also, as we're at Erasmus University, I think it's important as well that the people themselves also need to be ready for a reformation, and they have to think differently. They have to understand that they are free to choose. And right now, there's a sort of divine right of bankers and divine right of central bankers, and that they somehow can control the tides and the weather and the circulation of the earth. That they can control all sorts of things that they can't. So I think people have to be ready to be free to choose a different path.
okay.
Well, I'm afraid you have to reinterpret the question.
How do we start a money revolution? How do we start a discussion on the monetary system?
Well, fire all the establishment economists from the universities and the government.
Okay. Okay, next question.
Yeah. Professor, I agree we are in a race to the bottom. And the central bankers are with unconventional measures and procedures working. And we need a revolution. I think the revolution will easily come. We don't have to convince politicians because the system will break anyway.
What's the question?
But now the question, when will that happen?
When do you think, so the question is, when do you think things are going to get really bad, or are they really bad already?
I think they are really bad already. But I want to remind people that just before World War I, over 100 years ago, there was a saying that the German universities are the intellectual bodyguard for the House of Hohenzollern. Now, today, the central banks around the world are the intellectual bodyguard for the US Treasury. And the more this develops, the worse it will get.
Okay. Thank you.
Maybe one remark.
One quick remark.
Maybe yours mentioned it really briefly, but neoclassical economics, so that's really mainstream economics, what is taught on all universities. That's, I think, crucial to understand. And that's a kind of legitimation of what central bankers are doing. And there's, I think, a real issue.
Also,
Completely agree.
also note that the central banks are out of bullets right now. Zero interest rates are at zero. Their balance sheets are at $4.5 trillion in the U.S.
Yeah.
There's not much room for maneuver now. So, like as he said, like we're at the end game anyway. So you're going to have to get up and fight. It doesn't matter if you want to or not.
I actually calculated the assets to equity of the Federal Reserve System yesterday. It's 75 to 1. In the back, please. Let's just.
Yeah, two more questions.
Yeah.
First about.
One question.
Oh.
Yeah. One question in, one question.
Let's make it quick. The questions.
My fourth question. We've discussed the system, the financial system, central banking, and so on. Quantitative easing, and if I look at quantitative easing, then I see, what's happening. Then I first see, for example, with the ECB, that the ECB creates money for the banks. They buy bad qualities from the banks, And secondly, they create money for the banks. So they say they create liquidity. Liquidity goes to the non-economic parts of the economy. But what's really happening is they have told us that the liability from the banks should be shorter.
Okay, what's the question? Because we really need to move on.
Isn't it just a transfer of capital from the civilian to the banks?
Okay, so the question is, I think, is it a transfer of, is quantitative easing and other unconventional, is it just a transfer from banks to the center? From the ordinary citizens to banks?
Okay. Is quantitative easing just a transfer of wealth, of capital from the citizen to the banks?
I have to agree with that.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Okay. We all agree.
Yay.
Okay.
And maybe I can add.
Plain highway robbery. That's what it is.
Okay. We have time for one final question. Please formulate it quickly.
Mr. Fekete.
Where are we?
So to see, we are more or less of the same age. And I want to tell you a very small story, an experience I had on August 15, 1971. And I'm sure that you remember that day when President Nixon, that he disbagged the dollar from gold, right? And on that very day, in the evening, I was staying in the hotel. And it was a big hotel with a big bar, and before I went to bed, I had a nightcap, and the issue was the depegging of the dollar from gold. So I was listening, I had no clue in those days. And then all of a sudden I thought that maybe it was a good idea to buy gold. Then the guy on the other side of the bar, he got up from his chair and he said, "Sir, you must be out of your bloody mind." I didn't want to repeat that word. And I said, "Okay, but who are you to tell me that I have my bloody mind?" He took his card, he gave it to the bartender gave it to me, and I was reading, Senior Vice President of Citibank. In those days it was Citibank. Now that was on 15th of August, 1971, when the dollar was still standing at $35 an ounce. So $1, 1/35
Is there a question?
of an ounce.
Please.
What do we have today? And that's what I call purchasing power, yes? That's the word which I have missed this morning during the presentations. So by issuing QE, we are just blowing up our purchasing power. And that counts particularly for the middle class.
Okay.
Is there a question coming, or this is it? Oh, great. Well, thanks so much, Jan Willem, for moderating, and thanks, Mr. Fekete. Thanks, Stacy. Thanks, Martijn.